Kia ora tātou. Robert, thank you for that introduction. Let me acknowledge my colleague Ingrid Leary, MP for Twyford. Thank you very much for the opportunity to spend some time with you today. I want to refute any suggestion that I was terrified about coming down to temperatures of -5 from Auckland. And I wanted to use this opportunity today to really to set out for you the strategy and the work plan that we are undertaking as a government in this area of disarmament and arms control, a very important and significant part of New Zealand's foreign policy. These issues that we're going to talk about have a long whakapapa in our country and very significant implications for our future. And it's important that you, as part of the constituency of people in this country who care about these issues, see yourselves reflected in this work. Our credibility in this area as a country depends on that. I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge Professor Richard Jackson and the work of the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, which makes a valuable contribution to the discourse on peace and security. And the work that the Centre does makes a real difference. And it's a valued part of this constituency of institutions and people who care about and inform the work that our government does in this area. I want to share with you today our government's priorities for disarmament and non-proliferation. These have been set against a global security environment in which we've seen the re-emergence of great power rivalries, big challenges to international law, and the global rules-based order that New Zealand relies on, as well as rapid technological change that is outpacing government responses around the world. These global tensions have compounded the divisions and inefficiencies of the established disarmament fora in the world at the very time when they are needed the most. At the same time, disarmament and non-proliferation must compete for resources and political oxygen when other important global challenges like the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, like climate change, are having a lasting and severe impact on our systems. This requires New Zealand to be even more thoughtful, even more deliberate about how we work and where we put our efforts. The disarmament strategy that I'm going to talk about today tries to recognise these realities, and it provides a framework that I hope will keep us focused and motivated and flexible and able to respond to new and emerging challenges and opportunities as they arise. But I want to be clear that neither these challenges nor the dysfunction in the international environment lessens the critical importance of the work that we do on disarmament and arms control. While New Zealand invests heavily in diplomacy and collective action, armed conflict is always a possibility. When peaceful efforts fail to resolve civil conflicts, geopolitical tension, and disputes over land, water, and other resources. And so long as this dynamic remains, human security depends on a robust set of rules and norms regulating the weapons used in conflict. And in prohibiting, stigmatizing, and disincentivizing unacceptable methods of warfare, we can play a small part in mitigating the effects of conflict and keeping a small window open for negotiation and ultimately peace. At the heart of our work remains a steadfast view that progress on disarmament is not conditional on an improved international situation, as some have argued, but that it can contribute to its achievement. It also reflects the reality that while there are many factors beyond our control, we can make a difference in this. This work is an embodiment of New Zealanders' belief that our interest when it comes to peace and conflict is best served by pursuing collective human security and not a narrow understanding of national security. This enhances the safety and security of civilians, it demonstrates our independent foreign policy, and it reinforces our global reputation as a country as principled, responsible, and reliable. Our advocacy and determination on disarmament has, in some small way, strengthened international humanitarian law and ensured a continuing focus on the protection of civilians. New Zealand's long-standing positions on disarmament are an important part of our foreign policy, and we can trace their origins right back to the contribution made by former Prime Minister Peter Fraser to the establishment of the United Nations after the Second World War. Following that, and in light of the unfolding horror of nuclear testing in the Pacific, New Zealanders took to the streets to reject the right of states to test these weapons, both due to their very nature as an inhumane weapon of war, but also due to the devastation the tests themselves were inflicting on communities and ecosystems across the Pacific region, a region that had no stake whatsoever in nuclear war. These events triggered a powerful protest movement in our country, and they inspired the fourth Labour government to sign the Treaty of Rarotonga, declaring the South Pacific a zone free of nuclear weapons, and to pass the Nuclear Free Zone Act, formalising our nuclear free status and banning nuclear-powered ships from entering our waters. This policy quickly became a cornerstone of our independent foreign policy and eventually attracted significant cross-party support in the Parliament. New Zealand's steadfast support of international law and our determination to see inhumane weapons banned continued through the 1990s and the early 2000s, with the international movement to ban anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions, in which New Zealand played a central role. At the centre of these movements was a belief that each of these weapons breached key principles of international humanitarian law, and we wanted to see them outlawed for good. We continue to call on all countries to sign and ratify both conventions. Alongside these core disarmament developments, New Zealand has for several decades advanced a progressive foreign policy agenda that pursues the common good and advances collective human security. Take, for example, the significant role that New Zealand played in mediating peace during the civil war in Bougainville in Papua New Guinea in the 1990s. The role we played as chair of the Security Council at the UN when the P5 were steadfastly ignoring the genocide that was going on in Rwanda. Again, our firm stand against the Bush-Blair invasion of Iraq. This willingness to speak up and work with others for the global common good, even at times against the headwinds of great power politics, has become part of who we are. It's no surprise then that our disarmament work is built on these values, including those set out by our Foreign Minister, the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta, during her Waitangi Day speech. Through our efforts on these issues, we demonstrate our commitment as kaitiaki, or stewards of intergenerational well-being, in the interests of our global whanaunga, connectedness or shared sense of humanity. We show manaaki, kindness, or the reciprocity of goodwill, both in the pursuit of outcomes that improve the lives of people around the world and in the specific sense in our approach to disarmament negotiations. And it's through mahi-tahi and kotahitanga, collective benefits and shared aspiration that we strive to work with all partners, both domestically and internationally, to achieve our disarmament objectives. So what are these objectives? The strategy is grouped into three major themes: nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, strengthening international humanitarian law, and shaping the future. Our nuclear-related objectives reflect that eliminating nuclear weapons due to their immense destructive power and the existential threat that they pose is the most urgent item on the international disarmament agenda. While nuclear disarmament has received a much-needed boost from the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that New Zealand again played an important role in helping to get off the ground, this year's prospects in the nuclear disarmament space are not all that promising. Nuclear arsenals are being modernised and expanded, and there continue to be serious challenges to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. It's often unacknowledged, but the risks of a nuclear detonation are continuing to grow. Meanwhile, the effects of nuclear testing continue to be felt generations later with devastating impacts, including in the Pacific. In this area, New Zealand will pursue 3 major disarmament and non-proliferation objectives over the coming year. We want to contribute to a positive outcome at the review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, including, and importantly, a meaningful result on nuclear disarmament. We want to increase ratifications and signatories to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and achieve a positive result at its first meeting of states parties. And third, we aim to achieve progress on nuclear legacy issues in the Pacific, supporting the work of the Pacific Islands Forum, who earlier this year convened the first ever meeting of the states parties to the Treaty of Rarotonga, specifically with a view to tackling this issue of legacy contamination in the region. Our second work stream focuses on international humanitarian law, reflecting the humanitarian considerations that are at the heart of our approach to disarmament. New Zealand places value on upholding and, where necessary, strengthening international humanitarian law. This is the body of international law that restricts and regulates the means and methods of warfare in order to limit the effects of armed conflict and protect civilians. And it's a body of law that is under threat. Recent conflicts provide an overwhelming body of evidence that IHL is being blatantly violated. We see it on the news every night. Ratification of key treaties is slow and implementation is patchy. And as I will touch on shortly, states have been slow to respond to technological developments in a way that ensures international humanitarian law remains responsive to new challenges. We'll focus on 2 objectives in this space. First, adoption and promotion of an ambitious political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas. And secondly, increasing the uptake of key disarmament treaties, including the Arms Trade Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions in the Pacific and beyond. The third major strand of our strategy is dedicated to shaping the future, with a particular focus on 2 issues: outer space and autonomous weapons systems. As states move to exploit the opportunities space presents, we see growing evidence of irresponsible behaviour threatening to place space systems at risk. Greater competition and more activity threatens the sustainable and peaceful use of outer space, the weaponisation of which could have severe and far-reaching consequences here on Earth. Back closer to Earth, we see growing concern around the legal, political, and ethical implications of autonomous weapons systems, where a decision to kill could be made without human control or involvement. The development of autonomous technologies, including those linked to artificial intelligence, is rapidly outpacing policy and regulation. And with these challenges in mind, we'll focus on 2 key objectives. The first, developing a national policy and engaging actively in multilateral processes on responsible behaviours in space, including on space weaponisation. And secondly, developing a national policy on autonomous weapons systems that is fit for purpose and future-proof, and which forms the basis of our international engagement on this issue. And it's the latter topic, autonomous weapons, that I'd like to focus on for the rest of this session, both to update you on the policy development process and to invite your views on the work ahead. AI has vast potential to improve human lives, but also to disrupt our societies for the worse and even to threaten our very existence. Human societies benefited massively from advances in computing technology over recent decades. They've become integral to our daily lives and have delivered real benefits to well-being. But machine learning technology, robotics, and artificial intelligence are also being rapidly developed and sought out by militaries around the world, eager to remain on the cutting edge against a backdrop of growing uncertainty and rivalry. This presents enormous ethical concerns. At its most autonomous, this technology dehumanizes people and introduces biases that could further bake in systematic discrimination and the persecution of minorities. It endangers civilians by eroding their protections at the heart of international humanitarian law. And it creates real risks to international peace and security, including by potentially triggering a new arms race. The line between science fiction and industrial fact is increasingly blurred. Imagine a swarm of armed drones being unleashed on a packed sports stadium by a terrorist cell. Or an autonomous drone patrolling an area of desert, selecting a target using recognition software trained to identify a uniform, a weapon, a gesture, or a face, and then taking the decision to stun, maim, or kill the target. In theory, swarms of drones could include tens of thousands of them, creating what some scientists have described as a weapon akin to a low-scale nuclear device. Or consider the prospect of autonomous tanks and ships, unmanned and making targeting and kill decisions alone. With militaries less constrained by the political, moral, and practical constraints that come with deploying their own citizens in the battlefield, the potential for a continuous global battlefield emerges. And this all raises a number of practical questions. Would it be possible to program a machine to make decisions consistent with the key principles of international humanitarian law? How does a robot discriminate between a combatant and a civilian, or decide whether the action it is taking is proportionate? This, by its very nature, is a subjective decision. Do we want to remove the subtle and nuanced reasoning essential to these decisions, thereby removing the humanity that underpins them? A lack of human responsibility over these systems also poses challenges for accountability. Who, for example, would be responsible if an autonomous system decided to bomb a hospital or school? And what happens when these systems malfunction, as they do? Many of you will remember or have heard the story of the Soviet officer on duty on the morning of 26th of September 1983, when the early warning system he was manning wrongly detected an incoming nuclear strike. Military protocol dictated he inform his superiors, who would then, as per protocol, launch their own counter-strike. According to the automated system, there was a very high degree of confidence a strike was incoming. But the duty officer applied his humanity to the situation. Something didn't feel right. And in doing so, in failing to call the strike in, he almost certainly prevented setting the world off on a path to nuclear annihilation. And this is just one example. To many of us, the prospect of delegating the decision to kill to a machine will simply be morally abhorrent. Moreover, these systems are often very opaque, being by their nature black box systems. Machine learning is data-driven through the consumption of screeds of information to make more and more accurate predictions. Moreover, militaries keen to protect their edge on the battlefield are unlikely to disclose what would be considered highly sensitive information, which raises further issues, including how victims and their families could ever receive justice in the event of a violation of international humanitarian law. Are civilians really safer when the owner of an autonomous weapon, let alone the general public, does not know exactly where or when or what they will destroy? Tech workers, including those at Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, have been sounding the alarm since 2015 that their work, research, and product development are being adapted for use in warfare. Some companies have gone further, with leaders from Tesla, Google, and Apple all calling for a ban on fully autonomous weapons. Robotics companies such as ClearPath Robotics have been actively working with the international campaign to prohibit autonomous weapons systems. And yet there are already a number of weapons systems in operation today that have significant autonomous characteristics. While these fall short of what would be considered fully autonomous weapons, it does show that modern warfare is embracing this new technology. And as you can see, the legal and ethical challenges posed by autonomous weapons systems and by their inherent unpredictability are profound. But they also pose a significant policy challenge given their intersection with emerging technology, foreign policy, and military capability. So what are we doing about this? Well, because of the importance of this issue and the speed at which autonomous technologies are being developed, I've directed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade to accelerate the development of a comprehensive New Zealand policy on autonomous weapons systems, and to prepare for a more active role internationally on this issue. Accordingly, MFAT has launched a domestic multi-stakeholder consultation to support this process. We are changing the world one multi-stakeholder workshop at a time. We kicked off this work in April with a workshop which brought together academics, activists, officials, defence personnel, and entrepreneurs. I thought it was very useful in demonstrating the breadth of the challenges posed by autonomous weapons and a widely held view that New Zealand should step up its efforts both at home and abroad. This work continues, and engagement, including via forums like this, will be an important component of it. Since then, the International Committee of the Red Cross has released its policy position on autonomous weapons, which provide a clear account of what's at stake and why urgent progress is required to adopt a new legally binding rules to address the challenges posed by this issue. And as I hope I've been able to outline today, the work we are doing cuts to the heart of the future of warfare on how best to ensure the safety and security of New Zealand and our partners in a world where autonomous technology is increasingly ubiquitous, and on how to uphold the global rules-based order and protect the disarmament and humanitarian work we've contributed to over decades. I've committed New Zealand to building an alliance of countries working towards an international and legally binding instrument prohibiting and regulating unacceptable autonomous weapons systems. Now, this, of course, relies on other nations joining us in this effort. As Minister, I have and will continue to be active in taking this up with my ministerial counterparts overseas, because ultimately, if we want to progress with a legally binding instrument, it will take a group of countries alongside civil society to lead the way. And at this point, it's important, I think, to recognise the vital role of civil society, as always, leading the way in confronting these frontier issues. In this case, it is the international campaign to ban killer robots, headed up by New Zealander Mary Wareham. New Zealand, like many of our partners, is currently in the throes of developing policy. And it's important that we do this to determine the exact parameters of this work and its broader impacts. But it will come as no surprise to anybody that New Zealand remains deeply supportive of ensuring that international humanitarian law remains up to date and relevant, and that when the ICRC, the guardians of international humanitarian law, say that we need a new international instrument to achieve this, we support them. We will, of course, continue to harness the knowledge and experience of our local academics, activists, and officials, which forms the basis of our engagement with overseas partners. And we're working closely with civil society and the International Committee of the Red Cross to share notes and tap into their expertise. This, of course, is necessary in such a technical field, but that complexity should not scare us off. We have, of course, scaled similarly large tasks in the not too distant past. I look forward to engaging with some of you further in this room as we advance this mahi further. Thank you for listening. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.